In Venezuela, every person carries a genetic story unlike anywhere else in the world. A story written in their DNA, shaped by centuries of migrations, conflicts, and survival. But what makes Venezuelan DNA so different from its neighbors? Why do scientists find it fascinating? The answer isn't just in history books. It's hidden in the very bloodlines of the Venezuelan people. Geneticists have long studied the DNA of different populations to understand where they come from and how they evolved. When they looked at Venezuela, they found something extraordinary, a mix of three completely different worlds. Unlike countries with dominant single ancestry backgrounds, Venezuela is a true genetic mosaic, where indigenous, European, and African lineages have intertwined over centuries. But the way this mixture happened is not what you might expect. Long before Spanish ships arrived on its shores, Venezuela was home to powerful indigenous civilizations. The Carib, Arawak, and Amazonian tribes thrived here for thousands of years, their DNA deeply embedded in the land. They hunted, fished, and built complex societies, unaware that their genetic legacy would one day merge with two other continents. The arrival of European explorers in the 16th century changed everything. Spanish men, arriving without European women, fathered children with indigenous and later African women, creating a unique genetic structure that still defines Venezuela today. What makes this story even more fascinating is that it's written in the Y chromosomes and mitochondrial DNA of Venezuelans. Genetic studies reveal that while most men in Venezuela carry European Y DNA, meaning their paternal ancestors were Spanish or other European settlers, their maternal lineage, the mitochondrial DNA passed from mother to child, remains largely indigenous or African. This sex-biased genetic pattern is a direct result of colonization, where European men dominated the paternal lineage, while indigenous and African women carried forward their mitochondrial heritage. This pattern is found in other Latin American countries too, but Venezuela's specific combination of influences makes it stand out. European migration didn't stop with the Spanish. Over the centuries, Italians, Portuguese, and Germans settled in Venezuela, particularly in places like Colonia Tovar, where German ancestry remains remarkably preserved due to isolation. Meanwhile, the African genetic influence is concentrated in coastal communities like Barlovento and parts of Zulia and Sucre, where the descendants of enslaved Africans still carry unique genetic markers linking them back to West and Central Africa. This tricontinental mixture makes Venezuelan DNA both complex and distinct, unlike any other country in South America. The genetic landscape of Venezuela is also diverse regionally. In the Amazon basin, some indigenous groups remain genetically isolated, their DNA almost untouched by European or African ancestry. In contrast, urban centers like Caracas and Maracaibo have the most genetically mixed populations, with a balance of all three ancestries. And then there are the Andean states, where the indigenous European blend is strongest, and African influence is minimal due to the region's history and geography. Every Venezuelan carries a unique genetic signature that connects them to multiple continents. But what does this mean for their health, identity, and the way scientists study genetics? That's what we'll explore next. Venezuela's DNA is unlike any other. It carries the imprint of three powerful ancestral forces: indigenous civilizations that thrived for thousands of years, European explorers who reshaped the land, and African communities who endured unimaginable hardships but left an undeniable legacy. But this genetic blend didn't happen by chance. It was shaped by war, survival, and the shifting tides of history. To understand Venezuelan DNA, we have to go back to the very beginning. Before the arrival of Europeans, the land was home to diverse indigenous groups. These weren't small, isolated tribes. They were part of expansive civilizations with vast trade networks and deep cultural traditions. The Carib and Arawak peoples, among others, lived across the region, leaving behind not just language and traditions, but a strong genetic imprint that still exists in modern Venezuelans. Then came the Spanish conquest. Unlike in some parts of the world, where European settlers arrived with their families, the early Spanish colonizers in Venezuela were mostly men. With few European women among them, they intermarried with indigenous communities, forever altering the country's genetic structure. Over generations, these unions formed the foundation of what would become the mestizo population, But the transformation of Venezuelan DNA didn't stop there. The transatlantic slave trade brought another wave of genetic change. Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands, primarily from West and Central Africa, and brought to Venezuela to work on plantations. Though they faced extreme hardship, their resilience ensured that their genetic legacy endured, particularly in coastal and lowland regions. Today, this African ancestry is strongest in areas like Barlovento and Maracaibo, where Afro-Venezuelan communities maintain cultural and genetic connections to their ancestral lands. But what makes Venezuelan DNA so different from other Latin American countries with similar histories? One of the key reasons is the specific proportions of these three ancestral groups and how they vary across different regions. While some countries have more extreme divides, like Brazil's heavily African-influenced Northeast or Peru's predominantly indigenous highlands, Venezuela's genetic mix is more balanced and widespread. Studies estimate that, on average, Venezuelans have around 50 to 60% European ancestry, 20 to 30% indigenous, and 15 to 20% African, a unique distribution that sets them apart from neighboring populations. Another defining feature of Venezuelan genetics is the strong presence of European paternal lineage. The majority of Venezuelan men carry European Y-DNA, meaning their direct paternal ancestors were from Spain, Portugal, or Italy. Meanwhile, indigenous and African maternal ancestry dominates in mitochondrial DNA, reflecting a historical pattern where men from Europe mixed with indigenous and African women. This is a direct genetic fingerprint of colonial history, showing how different ancestral groups contributed to Venezuela's modern population in an uneven but lasting way. But Venezuela's genetic story isn't just about historical migrations. It also has real-world implications for health, identity, and even forensic science. The genetic diversity of the country has influenced everything from disease susceptibility to how Venezuelans respond to certain medications. Scientists studying Venezuelan DNA continue to uncover fascinating insights into ancestry, evolution, and human adaptation, proving that DNA is more than just a record of the past. It's a key to understanding the present and future. Venezuela's DNA is more than just a blend of three continents. It's a genetic fingerprint of history itself. But what truly makes it different is not just the mix, but how that mix happened. Every country in Latin America has some level of indigenous, European, and African ancestry. But Venezuela's genetic formation followed a unique path, shaping a population unlike any other. Before Spanish ships ever reached these shores, the land was home to deeply rooted indigenous nations. These were not isolated tribes, but complex societies that had adapted to their environment for thousands of years. Some lived in the rainforests, isolated from the rest of the world, while others built vast trade routes stretching across the Caribbean and the Amazon. Their genes carried markers of ancient migrations from Asia, passed down through generations. These indigenous lineages, though partially diluted today, remain strong, especially in maternal ancestry. The arrival of Europeans set off a chain reaction that would redefine Venezuelan DNA. The Spanish weren't the only ones. Over time, Italians, Portuguese, and Germans added new genetic layers, but their influence wasn't evenly distributed. Some regions saw high concentrations of European settlers, while others remained dominated by indigenous or African heritage. In places like Colonia Tovar, European ancestry remains remarkably intact due to centuries of isolation, while in urban centers, a deeply mixed population emerged. But one of the most defining events in Venezuela's genetic history was the forced arrival of Africans through the transatlantic slave trade. Unlike voluntary migration, this was a brutal disruption. Yet despite the horrors they endured, African communities preserved their identity, language, and genetic legacy. Today, their DNA is strongest in coastal and lowland regions, where Afro-Venezuelan communities have maintained traditions, dialects, and even certain genetic traits linked to resistance against diseases like malaria. What sets Venezuela apart from its neighbors is the balance of these influences. In some Latin American countries, indigenous ancestry dominates. In others, European or African genes take precedence. Venezuela stands in the middle, with a near-even tri-hybrid mix that varies by region. This diversity can be seen in physical traits, genetic health markers, and even the way different groups react to certain diseases or medications. And then there's the fascinating sex-biased genetic pattern, the genetic evidence of history's unwritten stories. The vast majority of European DNA in Venezuela comes from male ancestry, while indigenous and African genes are carried mostly through maternal lines. This isn't a coincidence. It reflects the power dynamics of colonization, where European men fathered children with indigenous and African women. This left a lasting genetic structure that still defines Venezuelan DNA today. But this is more than just history. It's a scientific key to understanding human adaptation, disease resistance, and even forensic identification. By studying Venezuelan genetics, researchers gain insight into how populations evolve under unique conditions, how different ancestries interact, and what that means for the future of medicine and ancestry research. Not all Venezuelans share the same DNA. The country's genetic landscape is a patchwork of ancestry, shaped by geography, migration, and history. From the Afro-descendant coastal towns to the untouched indigenous communities of the Amazon, every region tells a different story, encoded in the bloodlines of its people. One of the most striking genetic contrasts can be found along Venezuela's northern coast, where centuries of African heritage remain deeply embedded. Regions like Barlovento, Zulia, and parts of Sucre have some of the highest concentrations of African ancestry, a legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. In these communities, certain genetic traits, like a higher frequency of sickle cell trait, are more common, reflecting adaptation to ancestral environments in Africa. But these same regions also absorbed European and indigenous influences, creating a distinct Afro-Venezuelan genetic identity that is different from African-descended populations in the Caribbean or Brazil. In stark contrast, the Amazonian and southern regions tell an entirely different genetic story. Here, indigenous groups like the Yanomami, Pemen, and Wareo have lived for generations with minimal contact with outside populations. Their genetic markers are some of the purest representations of pre-Columbian ancestry in Venezuela. These groups have unique immune system adaptations and rare genetic variations not found in the rest of the population. For researchers, studying these isolated populations is crucial in understanding human genetic diversity and adaptation in extreme environments. Moving toward the Andean regions and western Venezuela, the genetic mix shifts again. States like Mérida, Taquara, and Trujillo have historically been strongholds of indigenous European blending. Unlike the coastal areas, where African ancestry plays a significant role, these highland regions have retained a more dominant indigenous and European mixture, influenced by geography and colonial settlement patterns. Many of these communities trace their roots to Andean civilizations, and their DNA reflects a deeper Native American heritage compared to the rest of the country. Then there are the urban centers, where genetic diversity reaches its peak. Cities like Caracas, Maracaibo, and Valencia have absorbed migration waves from all regions, making them melting pots of ancestry. However, even within these cities, genetics can correlate with social and economic background. Studies have shown that different socioeconomic classes in Caracas, for example, have varying levels of indigenous, African, and European ancestry, reflecting centuries of social stratification. One of the most fascinating outliers in Venezuela's genetic landscape is Colonia Tovar, a town with an unusually high percentage of German ancestry. Founded in the 19th century by German settlers, the town remained relatively isolated for generations, preserving its distinct European genetic signature. This small population is an example of how migration and cultural isolation can shape the genetic makeup of specific communities, making them stand apart from the national average. Venezuela's DNA is anything but uniform. It is a mosaic of different ancestries, shaped by history and geography in ways that make every region unique. From the Afro-Caribbean coastal towns to the indigenous enclaves of the Amazon, the country's genetic diversity is testament to its complex past and evolving identity. Venezuela's genetic makeup is often compared to its neighbors, but when you look closer, the differences become impossible to ignore. While the entire region shares a history of colonization, indigenous civilizations, and African influence, the way these elements blended in Venezuela makes its DNA stand apart from countries like Colombia, Brazil, and the Caribbean nations. Take Colombia, for example, Venezuela's closest neighbor, yet genetically distinct in key ways. While both nations share a tri-hybrid ancestry of indigenous, European, and African roots, the regional variation in Colombia is more extreme. Along Colombia's Pacific coast, African ancestry dominates, making up as much as 80% of the gene pool in some areas, whereas in the Andean highlands, Native American DNA remains the strongest influence. Venezuela, on the other hand, has a more balanced mix across the country, without such stark divides. Even in areas with high African ancestry, it remains integrated into a broader genetic structure rather than forming isolated genetic pockets as seen in Colombia. The contrast is even sharper when you compare Venezuela to Caribbean nations like the Dominican Republic, Cuba, or Trinidad and Tobago. In these islands, the indigenous gene pool was almost entirely erased during European colonization. While African and European ancestry dominate the genetic makeup of the Caribbean, Venezuela retains a much stronger indigenous component. Mitochondrial DNA studies reveal that Venezuelan maternal ancestry is still largely indigenous, something far less common in places like the Dominican Republic, where Taino ancestry survives only in small traces. Then there's Brazil, a country with a similar triracial mix, but a completely different genetic distribution. Brazil received one of the largest forced migrations of enslaved Africans in history, leading to a much stronger African genetic presence overall. Northeast Brazil, for example, has some regions where African ancestry surpasses 50%, something not seen anywhere in Venezuela. On the other hand, Venezuela has a higher indigenous contribution on average compared to most of Brazil, outside of the Amazon. The contrast highlights how historical migration patterns shaped two neighboring countries in vastly different ways. Even the Andean nations like Bolivia, Peru, and Ecuador diverge from Venezuela in genetic structure. These countries have the highest percentage of indigenous ancestry in South America, with some populations reaching 80 to 90% Native American DNA. Venezuela, despite its strong indigenous foundation, has a much higher European and African influence in comparison, placing it in a genetic category distinct from the Andean world. While Latin America shares a connected history, Venezuela's specific balance of indigenous, European, and African genes, combined with how these influences spread throughout the country, makes its genetic landscape one of a kind. No other country in the region has quite the same mix, making Venezuelan DNA a fascinating case for geneticists studying human migration, adaptation, and ancestry. Venezuelan DNA isn't just a fascinating blend of different ancestries. It also holds key insights into human health, disease, and genetic adaptation. The way different ancestral groups contributed to the population has left a genetic footprint that affects everything from disease susceptibility to metabolism and even immune responses. One of the most well-documented examples is the distribution of genetic disorders linked to African ancestry. Conditions like sickle cell disease and glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase G6PD deficiency are more common in regions with strong Afro-Venezuelan heritage, particularly along the northern coast. These genetic traits originally developed as protective adaptations against malaria, which was widespread in Africa. While they provided an evolutionary advantage in tropical climates, they can pose health risks in modern populations. But indigenous ancestry also plays a crucial role in shaping the health of Venezuelans today. Studies have shown that certain genetic variants associated with type 2 diabetes and obesity are more common in populations with significant Native American ancestry. This is due to an evolutionary history where indigenous groups thrived in environments with limited food resources, leading to genetic adaptations that stored energy efficiently. However, in today's world, where high-calorie diets are widespread, these same genetic traits can increase the risk of diabetes, metabolic disorders, and obesity-related diseases. European ancestry has introduced its own genetic influences, particularly in cardiovascular health and metabolic processing. Some genetic markers linked to higher cholesterol levels and hypertension are found more frequently in populations with strong European heritage. Additionally, certain enzyme variations that affect how the body metabolizes alcohol and medications can be traced back to European populations, influencing how different Venezuelans respond to pharmaceutical treatments. Venezuela's genetic diversity also plays a role in immune system function. The mix of indigenous, African, and European immune system genes means that Venezuelans have a highly diverse HLA, human leukocyte antigen profile, which affects how the body responds to infections and vaccines. Some immune system genes inherited from indigenous ancestors provide strong resistance to tropical diseases, while African-derived immune markers have been linked to stronger inflammatory responses. These genetic factors can determine how Venezuelans react to viruses, bacterial infections, and even autoimmune conditions. One of the most famous genetic phenomena in Venezuela is the Huntington's disease cluster in the state of Zulia. Thousands of individuals in this region carry a rare genetic mutation for Huntington's disease, a fatal neurodegenerative disorder. This cluster can be traced back to a single European ancestor who arrived in Venezuela centuries ago, creating one of the largest known family networks of Huntington's carriers in the world. This case has been critical in medical research, helping scientists understand how the disease develops and how genetics influence its progression. Venezuelan DNA isn't just a historical record, it's an active part of modern medicine. The study of genetic diversity in Venezuela is crucial for precision medicine, where treatments can be tailored to different genetic backgrounds. As genetic research continues, understanding Venezuela's unique ancestry composition could lead to better healthcare strategies, improved disease prevention, and even new discoveries about human biology. The study of Venezuelan DNA is more than just a look into the past. It's a scientific breakthrough that helps us understand human migration, genetic adaptation, and even the future of medicine. Every piece of DNA carries a story, a direct link to ancestors who lived through war, colonization, and survival. But beyond history, the genes of Venezuelans reveal something even more important: how populations evolve and what that means for the future of genetics. One of the biggest revelations from Venezuelan genetic studies is sex-biased gene flow, a pattern where one group contributes more to the paternal or maternal lineage. In Venezuela, the overwhelming majority of Y chromosomes come from European ancestors, while indigenous and African lineages dominate maternal DNA. This means that the genetic contribution was not evenly mixed. It was shaped by historical power dynamics, social structures, and migration patterns. The result is a modern Venezuelan population whose genetic composition tells the untold stories of colonization and survival. But Venezuela's genetic landscape also provides a rare opportunity to study founder effects and genetic drift. In some communities, genetic disorders or rare traits have become unusually common due to the isolation of certain populations. A perfect example is the Yanomami people in the Amazon, whose centuries of genetic isolation have led to unique genetic markers not found in the rest of the country. Another case is the Huntington's disease cluster in Zulia, where a single ancestor passed down a rare genetic mutation that still affects thousands of people today. These isolated cases give scientists a real-time look at how genetic traits spread, how mutations persist, and how isolated groups develop distinct genetic identities. Another key factor that makes Venezuelan DNA important for research is its genetic heterogeneity. The country isn't a single, uniform genetic population. It's a collection of multiple subgroups, each with different ancestry compositions. This means that genetic studies must take regional differences into account rather than treating Venezuelans as a homogeneous group. For example, a DNA study conducted in an indigenous Amazonian community would give a completely different result compared to a study in a coastal Afro-Venezuelan town. Understanding this substructure is essential for forensic science, ancestry research, and even genetic-based medical treatments. Venezuelan DNA is also key to tracing migration patterns on a larger scale. Certain genetic markers found in Venezuelans can be linked back to specific indigenous tribes in Central America, South America, and even the Caribbean. Similarly, African-derived genetic markers in Venezuela can be traced to West and Central African populations, confirming the routes of the transatlantic slave trade. Even the European ancestry in Venezuela can be mapped, revealing distinct influences from Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Germany. By studying these genetic connections, scientists can reconstruct ancient human migrations and see how different populations interacted over centuries. But perhaps the most exciting aspect of Venezuelan genetics is its potential to revolutionize medical research. The unique mix of indigenous, European, and African DNA in Venezuela means that its population carries a wide range of genetic variations that can be used to better understand disease, drug responses, and genetic adaptations. Venezuelans have inherited immunity genes from indigenous ancestors, metabolic traits from Europeans, and resistance markers from African lineage, each of which has major implications for how medicine is developed and personalized healthcare treatments are designed. Venezuelan DNA is more than just a record of history. It's a key to unlocking the secrets of genetics, health, and human evolution. As scientists continue to study its complexities, Venezuela's genetic blueprint will provide answers to some of the biggest questions about ancestry, adaptation, and the future of human biology. Venezuelan DNA is more than just a fascinating mix. It has real-world applications that extend far beyond ancestry. One of the most important areas where genetics plays a role is forensic science. In a country with such a diverse gene pool, DNA analysis isn't just about identifying where someone's ancestors came from. It's also about solving crimes, identifying missing persons, and even understanding how genetic traits influence physical characteristics. But with such a complex genetic structure, forensic experts face unique challenges when working with Venezuelan DNA. One of the biggest challenges is the high genetic variability across different regions. DNA markers that might be common in one group can be completely absent in another. For example, a forensic DNA sample taken from a person of indigenous descent might not match reference samples from Venezuela's general population because indigenous communities have remained genetically distinct. The same applies to Afro-Venezuelan populations, which carry genetic markers that link back to specific African regions, rather than the more mixed profile seen in urban centers. This means that forensic databases must account for regional genetic differences to avoid misidentifications. Another factor that complicates forensic genetics in Venezuela is admixture proportions. Because Venezuelans have varying levels of indigenous, European, and African ancestry, DNA analysis must consider these multiple ancestral influences when determining identity. Unlike in countries where genetic backgrounds are more homogeneous, Venezuelan forensic investigations require advanced ancestry mapping techniques to accurately interpret results. Genetics isn't just useful for criminal investigations. It's also a powerful tool for tracing historical migrations and lost identities. DNA studies have helped Venezuelans uncover connections to ancestral populations they never knew existed. Many people who assumed they were primarily of European descent have discovered significant indigenous or African heritage through genetic testing, reshaping their understanding of identity and history. Venezuela's genetic diversity also has implications for personalized medicine. Forensic genetic studies have led to breakthroughs in understanding how different Venezuelan populations metabolize drugs, respond to diseases, and inherit genetic conditions. This is crucial for designing medical treatments that are tailored to specific genetic backgrounds. A one-size-fits-all approach to medicine doesn't work in a country as genetically diverse as Venezuela, and forensic genetics is playing an increasing role in developing precision healthcare strategies. As technology advances, the ability to analyze Venezuelan DNA will continue to improve. New sequencing techniques are allowing scientists to uncover deeper layers of ancestry, identify unknown genetic traits, and even reconstruct long-lost family histories. Whether it's forensic investigations, medical research, or ancestry mapping, Venezuelan genetics is proving to be a key to understanding not just the past, but the future of human biology.